Good morning, everyone. I am shooting my first solo podcast for you today. I have always said to my team that we will do these when they're timely and relevant, and we need to get something right out. So we are going to be discussing the NAR settlement today. This is something that is one of the first times in my career that I've been getting calls, even from friends and just regular consumers not in real estate, asking questions about what is this all about? So it is more complicated than it needs to be at this point because there aren't a lot of answers. And so I'm starting that every time we talk about this with our agents throughout the company. It's not meant to sound like, oh, we don't have the answers, but we don't. But the one thing that I can say is that we can't wait until we have every answer in July to address this. So we as realtors, as professionals, want to just keep moving, doing what we do best and helping the consumer in every way that we can. And what this really comes down to is getting all of those agreements signed up front, making sure that your services are understood and that everybody that's involved understands what that costs and what goes into it. So I'm going to kick us off today by just going through some frequently asked questions that we've seen and our answers for this. I'm hoping that this can help agents who are extremely busy in the spring market to listen to something like this while you're driving, because you are going to get questions. And this should be helpful for you just to kind of file this away, talking points, if you will, ways to simplify because it's very complicated. And the media is not helping because they're spreading a lot of misinformation. And I imagine as a consumer as well, which most consumers are in the housing market in some form, it's even more confusing because if it's confusing for us when we understand what MLS is and what NAR is and all of these letters that somebody that's not in the industry doesn't understand. It's something that we need to just simplify. So that's what I'm going to try to do today. So our frequently asked questions, obviously just kicking it off with what is the NAR settlement and what is it all about? So on Friday, March 15th, 2024, the National Association of REALTORS announced a proposed lawsuit settlement that included a monetary settlement, as well as 2 changes to business practices: the removal of the offer of buyer agent compensation in NAR-owned MLSs, and the added requirement for a buyer agent to use buyer agency representation agreements. The first part about NAR-owned MLSs, that's not something that the consumer really needs to worry about. Really what that means is it's going to be limited where you can list buyer compensation, and we'll get into why that's important. From a consumer standpoint, and then the added requirement to use buyer agency agreements. We've been pushing this for years, knowing this was coming. This is something, again, there's a ton of value that buyer agents are providing. It's just something that's different and new, and we need to learn to just right up front explain what the services are, what the immense value to those services are, and what those services are going to cost. And the question mark is going to be how that gets broken down at the closing table ultimately. And that's something that we're not going to get into today because we don't have the answers to that. What will change and when? That's another big question that we're getting. Assuming this proposed settlement is approved, the changes will take place in mid-July of 2024. We expect the MLSs to remove the offer of buyer agent compensation. As this proposal is written, sellers may still offer buyer agent compensation without it being published in MLS. There are some concerns that this could be a step away from consumer transparency. Buyer agents will also need to have signed agreements, just like how listing agents need to have signed agreements. So if you walk through that, listing agents always have signed agreements. They're going to sell your house. This is what they're going to do. This is the services that you will be getting, and this is what they cost. That's what we're going to need to do from a buyer standpoint. These are the services I'm providing, the value I'm providing to you as your representation. This is what it will cost you, just like it is for anybody working with a professional, really across any industry. So that shouldn't be a huge adjustment for either side. Some concerns about the consumer transparency. So buyer agency really kind of came to fruition in this country about 30 years ago. And it was all due to consumer protection. And we'll get into that a little bit, but just making sure that the consumer, the buyer, has representation, that they have a professional, and in a way that it's not discriminatory in terms of only if you can afford it. So the way that this was set up was for that very reason. So obviously there's some concern that that might be going away. And those are things that they're trying to address now, sort of in this scramble as we get closer to that date in July. And then the final piece of that is just offering compensation. So everyone's going to have a different opinion. This has always been negotiable. You've always been able to not offer compensation or offer different levels of compensation to a buyer agent. It's going to be where it can be published. And again, we don't have the answers to that yet. Most people that are educated on the process will realize that the seller stands to net more and or get a better, more prepared buyer if they have representation. So it's really in the seller's best interest to provide that compensation for a buyer agent to bring in a well-qualified buyer and get the most for their home. So that's what most people decide on, and they still can decide on that. It's just going to be a matter of where can we list that compensation. The next question, does everyone charge 6%? This is the piece that the media is just being the media. They are completely spreading false information. There's no way to deny that on this side. This allegation is just wildly inaccurate. Different marketplaces see different ranges of compensation from town to town, company to company, listing to listing. There has always been a variation in our marketplaces for compensation. The industry does not and cannot collaborate on what a universal commission rate can be. Commissions are derived from the brokerage. We discuss our services, market share, and experience, not what our competitors are asking for. That is the easiest way to describe it. Anyone who sold a house in this country knows that there's always been options. You can sell your house without a real estate agent if you so choose. You can sell your house with a real estate agent who might just throw it in MLS or throw a lockbox on it and not do much else. And you can sell your house with someone that's full service, that has a great network, that spends a lot of time and money and effort in marketing and is just going to provide you with the highest and best offer. So that's really what it comes down to. And that's a personal decision. And it's a decision that's always been available. So that this isn't really changing. And the 6% that the media has kind of keyed on is just completely inaccurate. And unfortunately, that's what the media does. The other question that is really interesting, and I think we could just kind of use our common sense for, is will this lower housing costs? If you just take a second to think about that, why would a seller take less money? Especially in the market that we're in, the inventory is so tight. Home prices in a free market economy are determined by supply and demand. Nothing in the settlement addresses the lack of supply or the high levels of demand. Therefore, this does not lower the cost of buying a home. The seller isn't going to just give back money if they're not giving the money to a buyer agent and somehow that works out for them in their way of how they do the math. They're going to keep the money. The market's still going to dictate the price. This isn't going to make it cheaper for the buyers. In fact, it could make it more expensive if they need to bring more cash to the table in order to have representation. So we're hoping that that gets worked out. What if I have an existing contract? Nothing is likely to change before the July target date. However, we are awaiting the final details of the settlement as approved by the court. At this time, our understanding is that when the July target date arrives, the only change to an existing contract is that no offer of buyer compensation from the listing agent or seller can be published in MLS, and agents working with buyers will need to have written contracts to represent them. So if you have an existing contract right now, and you have a property listed around here, I'm going to go ahead and say that likely if it's priced well, it won't be on the market anymore. And if you have an existing contract that's active in July, the only thing likely to change at this point is where you can list that buyer compensation. Like I said, all this has been a choice. So typically you've already worked that out with your buyer agent. In terms from an agent standpoint, you need to be getting those buyer agency agreements signed. What consumer protections are in the buyer representation? This is an important thing to think about. A buyer agent has the responsibility of being an exclusive fiduciary. Fiduciary duties are all of the duties that a real estate agent or broker is legally beholden to when working with a client. These duties, which are in the client's best interest, are obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable care. This is what we're talking about when we say that everybody should have a right to having representation and that it's going to create a problem within the market if only certain people have access to that, who have access to the extra capital to bring to the closing table. When I say bring to the closing table, all of these fees and everything included in a real estate transaction have always been negotiable, and they've always been that you're looking at the full picture. But what happens is ultimately the buyer is who brings the cash to the table, and it gets divvied up however everyone decided. And what we're trying to figure out is, are they going to be able to finance it? Are they going to be able to finance these fees so that they can have representation? That's going to be where we're seeing it handled differently. We're already seeing some portfolio lenders and things like that coming out with options. But what we need to see is the VAs, the first-time home buyers, really that everybody across every demographic will have access to representation, because that's something that everyone is sort of nervous about. Does a buyer in the market need buyer representation? A buyer does not need to use a buyer agent. However, in a low inventory seller's market, it is difficult to compete against other buyers who are getting expert advice on offer strategies and negotiation. That's where I'll leave it. It's a very wise decision to have buyer representation. Will buyer agency go away? No. Buyer agency is the way the buyers get expert guidance from preparation and search to offer strategy and negotiation and so much in between. A home represents an important investment, one that continues to be at the heart of financial wellness for most Americans. What are the risks with a buyer not having representation, not learning about off-market opportunities or anything that's happening not on the public market or online, things that are happening within a community? Your realtor is really tapped into that. Not being informed and educated about the market. Again, your realtor is going to give you all of that information. Not having a well-prepared competitive offer in a multiple offer situation. If you're in a multiple offer situation, which in a specific price range here in our market, you're always going to be in a competitive situation. Having a buyer agent who has likely worked with that seller agent, who knows, potentially has the insight of what might be enticing for the seller, things like that, they're going to know how to make your offer most competitive. As a consumer going in cold, you're likely not going to be able to get to the top of that pool. And I'll be honest, most sellers are educated by their agents to realize that someone who's represented by a strong buyer agent is prepared, has a strategy in place, and will likely get to the closing table. A consumer coming in off the street with no real, professional experience in this field, they might not get to the closing table. So you pose a risk just right there, not having a buyer agent. A lot of people think that they can come in without a buyer agent and be more enticing, and that's pretty far from the truth. And obviously just not getting a house is a big risk of not having a buyer agent. What can the listing agent not do for the buyer? They cannot do offer strategies that have your interest in mind. The listing agent represents the seller. They cannot recommend home inspectors under the Massachusetts law. Only a buyer agent exclusively representing the buyer can recommend a home inspector. Act as your exclusive fiduciary. Again, they represent the seller. Provide a comprehensive market analysis, interpretation for pricing, or advocate for you. Again, a very common misconception that if you come in without an agent, that someone is going to be enticed to take your offer. If a seller is willing to make compensation to an agent, then they see the value in you having an agent to get this deal done. And the seller's always going to look at their net. So that's really what it's going to come down to. And I am not saying that a listing agent won't help a buyer, but most real estate agents do not want to be in the situation of trying to represent both parties as best they can. They typically want you to have your own representation so that everything can go smoothly. I know that some of you rely on these. Like I said, you're busy, you're running around, you're throwing these on in the car. And I felt like it was important to read through these FAQs, things that we're seeing, hearing, and just make sure that you're on top of this. If you're getting questions, it's really simple. The long and the short of it is there's always been options. Compensation has always been, commission has always been an option for people. You don't have to take a lower compensation or a lower commission. If you're an agent who's going to go above and beyond and put, a ton of money into marketing and they're like, well, this person said that they would put it in MLS and put a lockbox on my house for this amount. If that's what they want, they're probably not going to make as much money, but you don't have to take it. So it works both ways. It's always been negotiable from both sides. And it's just about providing value and making sure that the consumer understands what you're doing. And as a consumer, making sure that you understand what your agent's doing for you, what the services are that you will be getting. So ultimately, this is a good thing. It's going to start a good conversation around all of that. And hopefully the people that are the best and have been providing the best service all along are going to be even more recognized, and consumers will feel good about the service that they're getting. So if you do have questions, if you want any clarity around anything that we said today, we'll continue to come out with some frequently asked questions as we keep going and as we get more information. But this is all the information that we have for now. We can't wait till July to talk about this. Like we mentioned, there's contracts that are going to be kind of active at that time. You should be starting to think about it now as you're signing new contracts, and definitely just make sure you're getting those buyer contracts signed. Thanks, everyone.